Hello everyone, and welcome to DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering the Cloaker. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. The Cloaker takes up page 41 of the Monster Manual, and its lore goes as follows. Cloakers earn their names for the resemblance they bear to dark leathery cloaks. Lurking in remote dungeons and caves, these stealthy predators wait to slay lone or injured prey stumbling through the darkness. Camouflaged Lurkers. Like a stingray, a cloaker's body is composed of cartilage and muscle. With its tail and fins unfurled, it flies through darkness and lurks among the shadows of caverns, the same way a stingray glides through the water and hides on the ocean floor. Parallel rows of round, black eye spots run along its back like buttons, and the ivory-colored claws on its cowl resemble bone clasps. When a cloaker unfurls and moves to attack, it reveals its pale underside and makes its true nature evident. Red eyes glow above rows of sharp teeth, and a long, pendulous tail whips behind it. Opportunistic Predators. When hunting, cloakers glide through the shadows at a safe distance behind groups of other creatures traversing the Underdark. They follow parties of humanoids to prey on the wounded after battle, or pursue herds of Underdark beasts, attacking the sick, the weak, or the straggling. Cloakers strike quickly and consume their meals as swiftly as possible, enveloping and devouring their victims. While it feeds, a cloaker uses its swift, whip-like tail for defense, although it rarely takes a stand against dangerous foes or groups of creatures. As an added defense, cloakers can create illusory duplicates of themselves. Haunting Moan. Cloakers' thoughts are alien to other life forms, and they communicate with one another through subsonic moans inaudible to most creatures. At higher intensities, a cloaker's haunting moan becomes audible, evoking sensations of doom and dread in creatures that hear it. Cloaker Conclaves. Cloakers prefer isolation, but they sometimes convene with other cloakers for defense or to exchange information about new dangers, suitable hunting grounds, or developments that might affect their habitats. When this convergence is complete, the cloakers separate again. And that's all we've got when it comes to the lore of a cloaker. It's pretty interesting. I would say that cloakers appear to be a form of ambush predator. They seem to reside in caves and dark areas in the Underdark and present themselves as something rather mundane that an unaware adventurer or opportunistic looter of some sort might try to approach, get close to the creature, thinking it was a cloak of some form, and strike while it was unawares. But for now, let's move on to the stat block of the Cloaker. The Cloaker is a large aberration with a chaotic neutral alignment. It has an armor class of 14, which is natural armor. It has hit points that average 78, or 12d10 plus 12, and it has a movement speed of 10 feet, along with a flying speed of 40 feet. The Cloaker has a strength of 17, a dexterity of 15, a constitution of 12, an intelligence of 13, a wisdom of 12, and a charisma of 14. Its skills include stealth plus 5. It has the senses of dark vision for 60 feet, and a passive perception of 11. The Cloaker speaks the languages of deep speech and undercommon, and is a challenge rating of 8. Onto the abilities. Damage transfer. While attached to a creature, the Cloaker takes only half the damage dealt to it, rounded down, and that creature takes the other half. False appearance. While the Cloaker remains motionless without its underside exposed, it is indistinguishable from a dark leather cloak. And finally, light sensitivity. While in bright light, the Cloaker has disadvantage on attack rolls and wisdom perception checks that rely on sight. Onto the actions. Multi-attack. The Cloaker makes 2 attacks, one with its bite and one with its tail. Bite is a melee weapon attack with a +6 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one creature. On a hit, it does an average of 10 or 2d6 plus 3 piercing damage, and if the target is large or smaller, the Cloaker attaches to it. If the Cloaker has advantage against the target, the Cloaker attaches to the target's head, and the target is blinded and unable to breathe while the Cloaker is attached. While attached, the Cloaker can make this attack only against the target and has advantage on the attack roll. The Cloaker can detach itself by spending 5 feet of its own movement. A creature, including the target, can take its action to detach the Cloaker by succeeding on a DC 16 strength check. Tail is a melee weapon attack with a +6 to hit, a reach of 10 feet on one creature. On a hit, it does an average of 7 or 1d8 +3 slashing damage. Moan. Each creature within 60 feet of the Cloaker that can hear its moan and that isn't an aberration must succeed on a DC 13 Wisdom saving throw or become frightened until the end of the Cloaker's next turn. If a creature's saving throw is successful, the creature is immune to the Cloaker's moan for the next 24 hours. Finally, Phantasms, which recharges after a short or long rest. The Cloaker magically creates 3 illusory duplicates of itself if it isn't in bright light. The duplicates move with it and mimic its actions, shifting positions so as to make it impossible to track which Cloaker is the real one. If the Cloaker is ever in an area of bright light, the duplicates disappear. Whenever any creature targets the Cloaker with an attack or a harmful spell while a duplicate remains, that creature rolls randomly to determine whether it targets the Cloaker or one of the duplicates. A creature is unaffected by this magical effect if it can't see or if it relies on senses other than sight. A duplicate has the Cloaker's AC and uses its saving throws. If an attack hits a duplicate, or if a duplicate fails the saving throw against an effect that deals damage, that duplicate disappears. And that's all we've got for the Cloaker when it comes to stats. A pretty interesting creature, one that I would think is sort of a sleeper creature. I don't see it necessarily used all that much. It doesn't appear to be the most popular of creatures, obviously, but I think there's a nice uniqueness to the Cloaker that can be implemented to create a interesting adventure and encounter scenario for your players. So, without further ado, let's jump into some adventure crafting. So immediately, the first thing that comes to mind for me in terms of using a Cloaker in an adventure or a scenario where your players would encounter one would obviously be some form of underground adventure, not necessarily within the Underdark, but perhaps some form of spelunking adventure, some form of even a scouting adventure, let's say. So I would implement the Cloaker as a monster for your players to contend with in the way that it would be an unsuspecting or unexpected, rather, creature that they would have to go up against. So, for example, say your players have made it to a town and in that town they have been offered a contract or some form of mission or quest in order to, let's say, traverse through a cave system that was recently discovered for perhaps a mining crew or something like that knows of a resource or a vein perhaps of some form of precious ore or metal, perhaps some sort of crystalline minerals like gemstones of some form. Perhaps there's even a vein of some magical essence that these miners choose to extract from the ground, but due to the fact that this environment has not been traversed or scouted out yet, let's say, your players have been charged with the task of going in there and clearing out whatever may be in there, as well as mapping out the environment for this mining crew or extraction crew, if you would. And as the players traverse through the cave system, you can throw in a bunch of other forms of creatures and monsters as well that would reside underground or in a cave somewhere, something like that. But perhaps there's a clutch of cloakers, perhaps there's a nest, like a nursery, let's say, of young cloakers that incubate there, and as the players traverse deeper and deeper and make it down to the depths of the cave system or the underground system, they stumble upon this area that has all sorts of cloakers hatching or being born out from this place, and that's where their encounter would take place. You could also change it up a little bit where perhaps the essence, if you were to go the route of this magical essence, let's say this sort of uncontrolled, unrefined, wild magic essence, is the reason why the cloakers are present in this cave system. Perhaps the essence that these miners want to extract from the earth is the same magical essence that is used to perhaps develop or that is used to incubate and birth these cloakers. I mean, you could even go the route of perhaps cloakers in your world are just bats, let's say, giant bats, and their exposure to this strange magical essence within these underground veins is something that mutates and corrupts them and turns them into cloakers, right? I think that'd be a cool little twist you could use that would probably make your players raise an eyebrow or two as they traverse through. Depending on how long you wanted to run this adventure using the Cloakers, you could even have this magical essence start corrupting them via hallucinations or perhaps strange thoughts that just cross their minds that they would never think of before. Perhaps there's something that is causing them to become more aggressive than they normally would. Maybe you have them roll a wisdom check or something like that, or a wisdom save to see if they can maintain their cognitive abilities and be able to traverse through as they were. You could even use the moans that the Cloakers have, the moan ability, and perhaps from a distance, the adventurers do not become necessarily frightened and unable to advance forward in the cave system, but the moan from a distance as it echoes off the tunnels and stuff like that, off the walls of the tunnels and stuff like that, can cause the players to become perhaps delirious or confused or get lost in some fashion throughout this system. Again, you can also have the adventurers become ambushed by the Cloakers. Perhaps in this cave there's a small little chamber that has a stash of treasure and shiny things and whatever it may be, and because players are players, they'd be probably inclined to collect some form of treasure and something like that during their excursions. And you could have a room full of treasure, but oddly enough, there's a couple of cloaks that are hanging in the corners of the walls of this chamber or something to that effect. And when they try to grab these cloaks and take them, they get ambushed, and the Cloakers have a surprise attack on the unsuspecting adventurers. Another way that I could see Cloakers being used that's a little bit different from how they are presented in the lore would be using Cloakers as a form of surveillance, let's say. So perhaps there is a larger villain, perhaps you have a main antagonist, a big bad, and the upshot of the adventures that your players are going through are to eventually defeat, presumably, or overcome and destroy this antagonist. And perhaps the antagonist is not that of a typical aggressor where they use warfare and armies and stuff of that nature to take control and take over kingdoms or cities or pieces of land or areas, countries and stuff like that. Perhaps they go more the route of subterfuge and stealth and things of that nature. So perhaps when a Cloaker is present, the Cloaker is effectively there to run surveillance for this antagonist, come back and inform the antagonist of the goings-on of the world and perhaps of the goings-on of your adventuring party. You could use Cloakers very easily, I think, due to the fact that they can fly. You could use Cloakers very easily to hint at your players that they're being watched from a distance. Perhaps every time they set up for camp in the wild or anything like that, they can see something that looks like a very large, gigantic bat flying by and letting out this painful, baleful moan as it flies by with red eyes glowing in the moonlight or glowing in the darkness. And you can use the Cloaker to make your players, I think, feel a little bit on edge and paranoid, as it will eventually sink in for them that they are constantly being watched, let's say, or surveilled by these strange flying creatures. Finally, another way that I could see the Cloakers being used in a scenario or adventure would be almost one that's hallucinogenic, I would say. So imagine, if you would, the players have to endure some form of gauntlet or some form of ritual. And in order to be accepted or inducted into whatever place or faction or thing that they're trying to do, they have to successfully complete this trial. So you could use something to the effect of perhaps there's some sort of concoction or potion or solution that the adventurers have to drink, and after they drink the concoction, it sends them upon what would be considered, let's say, a spirit quest of sorts. And in that, I think that it could be pretty interesting because you could generate effectively this strange, chaotic, warped and twisted world that perhaps is nothing but different environments and biomes kind of bleeding into each other, but the sky above them is constantly black and dark, and there's these strange creatures floating by like stingrays with big red eyes and long tails that whip about. And as the players encounter them and try to overcome them and stuff of that nature, you have these cloakers effectively split into 3 from 1. And you can cause this sort of hectic, chaotic, surrounded by mirror copies of a couple of creatures. So within this trial, your players have to overcome the cloakers, and the cloakers can create phantasms and generate multiples of themselves or mirror images of themselves. And you can create something that's effectively a large-scale swarm, if you would. If you were to picture a swarm of bats kind of closing in on an individual or anything like that, you could do that same thing with cloakers, in that if you had 3 cloakers, for example, 3 cloakers, if they were to all generate phantasms, would create 3 cloakers and 9 mimics of those cloakers. 9 duplicates, I suppose, is more accurate. So your players, be it of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, they suddenly have to contend with a dozen cloakers. Well, what appears to be a dozen cloakers, that is. And I think that the cloaker could be used in an interesting fashion in that sense if you were to go the route of some sort of spirit quest, hallucinogenic gauntlet or trial that they have to overcome in order to be accepted into some place, perhaps, or perhaps inducted into a faction or something of that nature, due to the fact that cloakers kind of seem to be this strange amalgamation of a bunch of different creatures, and cloakers are by nature creatures that appear to be things that they are not, and that they can duplicate themselves and cause all of this sort of havoc and chaos and leave people sort of flat-footed and unexpecting of the true nature of what a cloaker is. Now, based on the look of a cloaker looks to be a pretty imposing creature. However, it's not necessarily an evil creature, so due to the fact that cloakers are chaotic neutral and their intelligence is average, I could certainly see how they would be used as some form of accomplice, let's say, not necessarily to an evil individual or an antagonist of some sort, but even just as an accomplice or a creature that serves a group or a faction in some way, shape, or form. I mean, for example, say there's a thieves guild or something in town, and by the very nature of the thieves guild and the way it conducts itself, it uses cloakers to send information between members of the guild, and it's quite effective to use cloakers due to the fact that they're only really effective as they travel at night, as they can't quite see during the day, and cloakers can actually communicate in deep speech and undercommon. And on top of that, cloakers have a natural camouflage in that they just look like cloaks, and on top of that, actually, they have a defense mechanism that they could use if ever they were made or discovered to be transporting sensitive information or anything like that. They can just split themselves into 4, or they can create 3 more mirror duplicates of themselves and essentially have them scatter, right? And confuse and throw off potential threats to them. But all in all, I think that the cloaker is a pretty interesting creature. I think it's definitely a sleeper creature. I've not used it myself in any of my sessions, and the cloaker is not necessarily a creature that I've heard or seen come up too frequently when discussing or looking at or researching information for D&D campaigns and stuff like that. But I think that the cloaker is actually really cool. It certainly looks really cool and quite deadly. And it seems to me to be a very interesting type of ambush predator creature that can be used for more than just your bog standard monster in the wild, if you would, if you wanted to go that route. I mean, it certainly works for a monster of the week type campaign, but I think that the cloaker would be really a cool monster to use as sort of commonplace or ever-present, let's say, and not necessarily in the Underdark, just due to the traits and abilities that it has, both through the lore and through its natural abilities. But that's all I got for you fine folks this week. I'd like to thank you very much once again for tuning in to this episode of Monsters Manifested. Next week's episode will be covering, a creature that comes from real-life mythology in the cockatrice. So that should be pretty interesting. We'll see what we can develop for that, and should be a good one, I think. But that's all I got for you fine folks today in this week's episode of Monsters Manifested. I'd like to thank you all once again very much for tuning in. I appreciate it. If you're listening to this episode of Monsters Manifested on YouTube, Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all of those fun things, as it would really help me out and help the channel grow and the podcast grow and all of those great things. And it would help me out quite a bit. But until next time, thank you all once again, and I'll see you on the next one. Have a good day, everyone.